911, what's your emergency?
In the quiet suburbs of California, a seemingly ordinary world was about to be shattered by a series of choices that no one could have predicted. Trust, something we give so easily, especially to those sworn to protect us, was about to be betrayed. But this betrayal was no ordinary crime. This is the story of a woman who held the law in her hands and a secret in her heart. A story where the thin line between right and wrong would blur beyond recognition, leading to a dark path filled with lies, scandal, and murder. Don't forget that every second counts when unraveling mysteries and uncovering the truth. If you're truly passionate about real-time crime stories and want to stay ahead of the curve, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join the Real-Time Crime 911 community today. Thank you. Detective Julia Thomas, respected by her peers, trusted by the community, and seemingly untouchable, was the last person anyone would suspect to be involved in such a shocking crime. But the truth can be a dangerous thing. It begins with an affair, hidden from the world, a dangerous liaison that no one ever imagined would spiral out of control. It was supposed to be a secret, a forbidden passion between Julia and the one person who could destroy everything she had worked for, a man she should never have trusted. But things took a turn no one saw coming. What started as a fleeting moment of weakness soon turned into something much darker. A pregnancy, undetected at first, but one that carried with it the weight of unbearable consequences. A life growing inside her, threatening to expose everything she had worked so hard to hide. And in the shadows, the clock was ticking. The pressure to cover her tracks grew unbearable. Her partner, a woman who trusted her more than anyone else, remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal unfolding beneath her nose. Julia's life, her career, her future, all hanging in the balance. But sometimes when the walls close in, desperation takes over. In an act of sheer panic, an irreversible decision was made. A life was taken, not by a criminal but by a detective sworn to uphold justice. In a quiet, seemingly peaceful neighborhood, the shocking murder would send shockwaves through the entire community. Who could have imagined that the very people we trust to protect us, the ones entrusted with upholding the law, would be the ones capable of breaking it in the most unimaginable way? How did Julia, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving justice, become the very person who tore it apart? But this is no simple case of betrayal. No, this story goes much deeper. It's a tale of love gone wrong, of a woman lost in her own lies, and of a deadly cover-up that would unravel piece by piece, bringing everyone, law enforcement, the community, and those closest to her, into the devastating truth. We'll dive into the chilling events that led up to the murder, the people involved, and the shocking investigation that would follow. Stay with us as we unravel the layers of deception and tragedy that have rocked this small California town, because sometimes the truth is more horrifying than anything we could ever imagine. This is the true story of Detective Julia Thomas, a woman who was caught in the tangled web of love, betrayal, and murder. But what happens when a detective becomes the criminal? How does the world of law and order crumble when the person you trust the most is the one who deceives you beyond repair? We begin this investigation not just to uncover the crime, but to explore the very human choices that led to the ultimate tragedy. Detective Julia Thomas, a woman who had made a name for herself as a dedicated officer, respected by her colleagues, trusted by her community, and admired by those who worked alongside her. Julia was the kind of person who commanded respect the moment she walked into a room, her sharp mind and unwavering sense of duty making her a force to be reckoned with. Yet for all her strength and composure, there was something about Julia that no one could quite figure out. A vulnerability she kept hidden behind the badge. Julia was a woman who lived in two worlds. One where she was a law enforcer, where integrity and justice meant everything. And the other, a world she kept locked away, one in which her desires and fears simmered beneath the surface, quietly bubbling to the point of eruption. Her partner, Detective Lisa Wells, was Julia's closest friend and confidant, a bond forged through years of working together. Lisa was as solid as they come, her loyalty to Julia unmatched. She trusted Julia with her life. Lisa had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. She was blissfully unaware of the dark secret her partner had been hiding for months. But it wasn't just Julia and Lisa in this complex, tangled mess. There was also Lisa's husband, Michael Wells, an ordinary man at first glance, someone who could easily blend into any crowd. Michael was charming, approachable, and seemingly content with his life. He had the perfect family, a beautiful wife, a house in Oak Ridge, and a steady job. He was the kind of man who lived by the rules, at least that was the perception. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of his seemingly ideal life, Michael was struggling, and it was during one of these quiet struggles that his path crossed with Julia's in ways no one could have predicted. It was a slow burn, an accidental touch at first, a shared moment of vulnerability. Julia had confided in Michael about the pressures of her job, about her personal battles, her frustrations with the never-ending demands placed on her as a woman in law enforcement. He listened intently, offering comfort when she needed it most. The connection was subtle, but undeniable. And one day, as the emotional tension grew between them, the line between professional courtesy and personal connection began to blur. At first, it was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a kiss that caught them both by surprise, a stolen glance in the quiet darkness of an empty room. But soon that kiss turned into something much more dangerous, a forbidden affair that once ignited would burn hotter and brighter than either Julia or Michael could have ever imagined. As the affair began, Julia found herself lost in a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, desire, fear. She had worked so hard to build her career, her reputation. But now, she found herself at a crossroads. The affair was a secret, something they both desperately tried to keep hidden from Lisa. After all, how could Julia, the woman who had sworn to uphold the law, betray her closest friend in such a deeply personal way? Yet the temptation was impossible to resist. Each stolen moment, each whispered conversation drew them closer, and as much as Julia wanted to pull away, she couldn't. Michael, with his warmth and quiet understanding, filled a void Julia didn't even know she had. But the affair was becoming a dangerous game, one that could destroy everything. The guilt gnawed at Julia every day, and as the relationship deepened, so did her fear. She knew that if anyone found out, if Lisa ever discovered the truth, it would be the end of her career, her friendship, and perhaps even her life as she knew it. And then, something happened that no one expected. Julia found herself pregnant. The pregnancy at first seemed like an impossible complication. How could this happen? How could Julia, the woman who had always been in control, let herself fall into such a reckless, dangerous trap? But as the days passed, the reality of the situation began to sink in. She was carrying Michael's child, a secret that would ruin everything. The fear of being exposed, the fear of losing her career, and the trust of those around her was unbearable. Julia tried to remain calm. She tried to think logically, but as the days passed, her panic began to grow. The pregnancy would eventually show, and with it, the truth would come to light. There was no way to hide it forever. Julia's mind raced. She couldn't tell Lisa. She couldn't go to Michael with the truth. What would happen to her career? What would happen to her life? And what about Lisa? What would she say when she found out? How could Julia ever face her again after everything she had done? As the weeks passed, Julia's guilt and anxiety mounted. The affair that had once been a source of excitement and escape was now a burden that she could no longer bear. The weight of the secret was crushing her, but there was no turning back now. She had to find a way to hide the pregnancy, to make sure no one would ever find out. But sometimes, when the pressure becomes too great, people do things they never thought possible. In the dark corners of Julia's mind, a terrifying thought began to take shape. What if she didn't have to keep hiding the secret? What if she could make it all go away? The tension between her desire to protect her career, her friendship, and her own twisted need to preserve her secret was building to a boiling point. What started as a simple affair, a momentary lapse in judgment, had now escalated into something far more dangerous, something far darker. Julia was cornered. And cornered animals, as we know, will do anything to escape. As we move forward, the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. The affair, the pregnancy, the lies, they are all leading somewhere. But where? And what will happen when the truth comes to light? This, dear viewers, is only the beginning. The beginning of Julia and Michael's affair was, like so many others, not the result of a single decision, but rather a series of small choices that led them down a path they never imagined they would walk. It all started during a routine investigation, one that had nothing to do with their personal lives. Julia and Michael were assigned to a case together. Nothing unusual. Julia, as always, was focused, professional, and deeply involved in her work. Michael, too, was no stranger to the demands of law enforcement. He was married to Lisa, a woman who had long been Julia's trusted partner in the field. Julia had always admired Michael from a distance. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and charming. But there was something else, too, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the case began to unravel and tensions rose between them that the unspoken tension between Julia and Michael started to grow. One late evening, after the case had been wrapped up for the night, the exhaustion and pressure of the job led Julia to confide in Michael. She needed someone to talk to, someone who would listen without judgment. She spoke of her frustrations, the way her career had become a constant battle, and how it was beginning to take a toll on her marriage to law enforcement and her sense of identity. Michael, always supportive, was there to listen, offering words of comfort and understanding. That night, as they shared a quiet moment of connection, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a glance that lingered too long, a moment of silence that hung between them before their lips met. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't expected, but once it happened, neither of them could turn back. The first kiss between Julia and Michael felt like a mistake, something they could chalk up to the stress of the job. But it wasn't long before that kiss became a part of their daily reality. It was the secret they shared, one they both knew had the potential to destroy everything. And yet, they couldn't stop. Julia had always been a woman of control. She had to be in her line of work. But now, in the face of this secret, she felt a loss of control that she hadn't experienced before. The affair was not just a betrayal of Lisa, but of everything Julia had worked for in her life. Her sense of self, her integrity, her career, all of it was now at risk. Yet, despite the mounting guilt and the weight of the secret, she continued the affair. It became more than just a physical connection. It was a place where Julia could escape from the demands of her life, her career, and the increasingly high expectations placed on her. For Michael, the affair was an escape, too. It was something that brought excitement and passion into a life that had begun to feel stale. His marriage to Lisa, despite being built on years of love and trust, had grown predictable. He wasn't looking for an affair, but somewhere along the way, he found himself drawn to Julia, her strength, her beauty, and her vulnerability. As the affair progressed, Michael found himself caught between two worlds, the life he had built with Lisa and the passionate secret he was living with Julia. Each world was feeding into the other, and the line between them was becoming increasingly blurred. But Julia's mental and emotional state was beginning to unravel. She had always been the picture of professionalism, but now, the affair was eating away at her. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but there was something else, too. The affair had sparked a side of her that she had buried deep inside, a side that craved the excitement, the thrill of doing something forbidden, of breaking the rules. It was a side of her she hadn't known existed until now. As the affair deepened, so did the pressure on Julia. She could no longer deny the reality that she was not just betraying her partner but also herself. The fear of discovery grew with each passing day, as did the tension in her relationship with Michael. What if Lisa found out? What if the truth came out and ruined everything? And yet Julia couldn't bring herself to end it. The connection, the passion, and the escape were too strong. But then, a new twist came. A pregnancy. Julia found herself pregnant, and the weight of the secret grew heavier than ever before. The affair was no longer just a betrayal of trust. It was now a life-changing situation. A baby. A child that would reveal the truth to the world. Julia's mind raced as she tried to figure out how to keep the pregnancy hidden. She knew that there was no way she could carry the baby to term and keep it a secret. The evidence would be too overwhelming. She couldn't even bear the thought of telling Michael. The fear of him rejecting her or leaving her alone in this new reality was unbearable. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Julia had always been a woman of logic, of reason, but now she was lost in a maze of emotions and consequences. The idea of keeping the pregnancy a secret seemed impossible. And yet, what other choice did she have? If anyone found out, her career would be over. Her relationship with Lisa would be shattered beyond repair. The damage would be irreversible. Julia began to retreat into herself, closing off from those who cared about her. She withdrew from Lisa, avoiding their usual conversations and spending more time at work, trying to distract herself from the growing reality of what was happening. Every time she saw Lisa, the guilt gnawed at her. How could she face her, knowing what she had done? How could she look her partner in the eye and pretend everything was normal when her life was spiraling out of control? The affair was no longer just about passion or excitement. It was now about survival, about keeping the secret, about maintaining the illusion of control. Julia knew she was playing a dangerous game, and yet every day she found herself sinking deeper into it. The stakes were higher now. The affair had gone from something risky to something that could destroy everything. Julia's life, once defined by her career and her role in law enforcement, was now defined by the weight of the secret she carried. She was a woman torn between her past and her future, her career and her desires, her duty and her betrayal, and all the while the clock was ticking. The pregnancy, now impossible to hide for much longer, loomed over her like a shadow. In those quiet, desperate moments, Julia's mind began to drift toward darker thoughts. What if the pregnancy could just disappear? What if she could erase the mistake she had made and return to her life as it once was? The possibility of making the problem go away completely, to hide the truth forever, began to take root in her mind. The affair, once a secret shared only between Julia and Michael, was now a ticking time bomb. The pregnancy had turned everything upside down, and with each passing day, Julia felt herself slipping further into a corner with no way out. There was no turning back now. The consequences of her actions were already set in motion. But one question loomed larger than all the others. How far would Julia go to protect her secret? The truth has a way of creeping to the surface, no matter how deep we bury it. Julia had been hiding her pregnancy for months, but the walls were closing in on her. Each day brought new fears, new risks, and a growing sense of urgency. The affair with Michael had been reckless, but the pregnancy, this was something else entirely. There was no escaping the consequences now. The reality was inescapable. Julia couldn't let this secret leak. It was far too dangerous, far too destructive, and as the pregnancy progressed, the pressure became unbearable. The stakes had never been higher. Where Julia had lived and worked for so long was now suffocating her. The very place she had once felt so safe now felt like a prison, each day a countdown to the inevitable reveal. But Julia had one more card to play: Michael. And for a while, he was the only one who knew. He was the only one who understood the desperation that had begun to consume her. But as her belly grew, so did the tension between them. Michael, too, was starting to feel the weight of what they had done. For Julia, the affair had started as a brief escape, a fleeting moment of passion. But now the consequences had caught up with her, and the stakes were too high to ignore. She knew that the life she had built, her career, her relationships, was all at risk. And as the days dragged on, Julia felt cornered, more and more trapped in the lie she had woven. But what Julia didn't expect was the shift in Michael. He wasn't the man she thought he was. In the beginning, he had seemed supportive, willing to help her through whatever consequences awaited them. But as the pregnancy advanced, Michael grew distant, his behavior erratic. At first, he reassured Julia that they could figure this out, that they would find a way to make everything work. But slowly, something shifted in him. The man who had once been her confidant began to pull away, and Julia began to suspect that he was hiding something from her. Was he thinking of leaving her? Was he beginning to fear the consequences of his own actions? The tension between them reached its breaking point one night. Julia had invited Michael over to her apartment, desperate to talk through their options, to figure out what to do before it was too late. But when he arrived, something in the air was different. There was no comforting embrace, no reassuring words. Instead, there was a coldness, a sharpness that Julia couldn't understand. Michael had always been a man of few words, but tonight, he was unrecognizable. He looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before, an unsettling look that sent chills down her spine. There was no warmth in his eyes, no trace of the man who had once been her lover, her confidant. "I can't do this anymore, Julia," he said, his voice low and strained. "This is too much. It's gone too far." The words hit Julia like a punch to the gut. She had prepared for many things, but not this. Not Michael pulling away, not Michael abandoning her when she needed him the most. "You have to help me," Julia pleaded, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. You're the only one who understands. You're the only one who knows." But Michael's eyes were empty now. He was no longer the man she had known. "You should have thought about that before," he said, his voice cold. "I never should have gotten involved with you in the first place. This is all your fault, Julia. You ruined everything." The words echoed in Julia's mind like a dagger to her heart. Her entire world was crumbling around her, and she knew that she was losing him, losing the one person who could have shared the burden of their secret. Her mind raced, heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had no plan for this moment. She had no way of knowing what she would do if Michael turned on her. But then as the tension between them mounted, something in Julia snapped. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only one thing that mattered now: keeping the secret. Keeping it hidden, at all costs. In a moment of terrifying desperation, Julia grabbed the nearby object, an ornamental knife, something she had never used in her life, and without thinking, drove it into Michael's chest. The shock of the act hit her immediately. His expression froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man who had once been the object of her deepest desire now lay in front of her, blood pooling around his body as the room became silent, save for the sound of Julia's own frantic breath. The room spun around her. Time seemed to slow, as though the world outside had stopped, leaving only the heavy, crushing reality of what she had just done. She stood there for a moment, staring at Michael's body, unable to move. The man who had been both her lover and her downfall now lay dead in front of her, and there was no going back. But Julia wasn't thinking clearly. In the fog of fear and panic, she didn't consider what came next. She only knew that she had to act quickly, had to make sure that no one could connect her to the murder. She cleaned up the scene as best as she could, wiping away any trace of her presence. But as she did, the weight of what she had just done began to settle in. Her life, the life she had carefully built, was over. There was no returning from this. The affair, the pregnancy, the lies, they had all led to this point, and now it was irreversible. Julia knew she had to flee. She had to disappear, erase herself from the equation before anyone could suspect what had really happened. In the days following Michael's death, the police investigation began, but Julia remained outwardly calm. She continued with her duties, performing the role of a detective, acting as if nothing had changed. But every moment, every breath, felt like a lie. Her guilt gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to stop. The stakes had become even higher. For the first time in her career, Julia realized that she was no longer the one chasing the criminals. She was now the one being hunted. The affair that had started as a brief escape had spiraled into something far darker, and now the consequences were too great to ignore. A life had been taken, and the price of Julia's secret was more than she could ever have imagined. After the murder of Michael Wells, the town of Oak Ridge was thrown into chaos. It was a case like no other, a tragedy that seemed to defy explanation. A respected detective, one who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, now had to face the unimaginable, the murder of a man she had once called a lover, and yet to the public it appeared to be just another case, a tragic crime in a quiet town. But behind the scenes, the investigation was far from straightforward. As the detectives on the case began to dig deeper, the truth remained hidden in the shadows, veiled by lies and deceit. At first, the investigation followed a typical trajectory. The Oak Ridge police were determined to uncover the truth behind Michael's murder. His body had been found in Julia's apartment, but there were no obvious signs of forced entry. The initial theory was that a burglary had gone wrong, that Michael had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The idea that the crime had been committed by someone close to Michael seemed unthinkable. How could one of their own, a seasoned detective, be capable of such an act? But as the investigation progressed, strange inconsistencies began to surface. It wasn't long before investigators started noticing red flags. Julia had a solid alibi for the night of the murder, but there was one thing that couldn't be explained: her behavior. Friends, colleagues, and even her partner all noticed that something was off. Julia was cold, distant, her once sharp instincts dulled by a layer of paranoia that no one could quite explain. She had become a shell of the woman she once was, and yet she continued to act as though everything was fine, as though nothing had changed. Then there was the missing phone. Michael's phone, which had been crucial in piecing together his final moments, had gone missing. Detective Thomas, a woman who had always prided herself on her meticulousness, claimed to have no knowledge of it. She said she had never seen it after Michael's death. The investigation into the phone's whereabouts became a pivotal turning point, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. However, as the days wore on, investigators began to uncover unsettling truths about Julia's past, things that didn't sit right with them. She had always been the model detective, so why had she been acting so strangely in the wake of the murder? Why was she avoiding questions, keeping to herself when she should have been taking charge of the investigation? Was she hiding something? The detectives digging into Michael's life soon learned about his troubled marriage to his wife, Lisa Wells. It had been a marriage on the rocks for months before Michael's death. There were rumors about infidelity, and it didn't take long for detectives to realize that Michael had been involved in a secret relationship with someone who might just be a key figure in the investigation. But the question remained: who was this woman? The more the investigation progressed, the more twists and turns emerged. Early witness testimonies seemed to point in all directions, causing confusion and misdirection. A local bartender who claimed to have seen Michael arguing with a woman the night of his death had described a tall woman with dark hair. But when the police pulled the surveillance footage, there was no woman matching that description. Yet the bartender's words stayed with the investigation team. Then there was the matter of the fingerprints. The forensic team had uncovered a set of fingerprints in Michael's apartment that didn't belong to him or his wife. The prints were small, but distinct. They didn't match any known criminals, and they didn't match the man Julia had claimed to be her only confidant in the affair. This discovery sent shockwaves through the team. Who else could have been there that night? At first, the thought that Julia herself might be involved seemed unthinkable to those closest to her. Her partner, Detective Ryan Brooks, defended her fiercely, brushing off any accusations and even going so far as to cast suspicion on others. He was convinced that Julia was innocent, but his blind loyalty only muddied the investigation further. As the weeks passed, the investigation uncovered more damning evidence, witnesses who had seen Julia and Michael together more often than she had ever admitted. The timeline of Michael's final hours, which Julia had initially seemed so certain of, didn't add up. The inconsistencies grew more pronounced, and detectives began to piece together a horrifying realization. Julia Thomas was connected to the crime in ways no one could have ever predicted. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that made investigators question Julia's involvement. It was her actions, her refusal to cooperate fully, her chilling detachment. Her emotional state was erratic. She was quick to anger and even quicker to shut down any probing questions. It became evident to the investigators that something was being hidden, something far darker than they had initially imagined. But no one could have predicted the breakthrough that would come next. One evening, a breakthrough witness came forward. A local resident, a woman who had once been a friend of Julia's, stepped forward with a bombshell. She claimed that she had overheard a heated conversation between Julia and Michael just days before his death. According to the witness, Julia had been desperate, begging Michael not to leave her. She had promised him everything, her career, her loyalty, and her silence. But Michael, it seemed, had been less than willing to keep their secret. He had threatened to expose their affair, even if it meant destroying her career. The witness went on to reveal a critical piece of information. She had heard Julia say, "I can't let you ruin everything. I've worked too hard for this." The chilling words echoed in the minds of the investigators. Was this the final, damning piece of the puzzle? As detectives followed the trail of clues, they began to realize that the case wasn't just about Michael's murder. It was about something far more complicated, a web of lies, deception, and betrayal that ran much deeper than they had initially thought. Finally, after weeks of investigation, the truth began to take shape. The missing phone was found, and its contents would provide the final evidence linking Julia to the murder. The text messages, the call logs, and even a series of voicemails from Michael, threatening to expose her secret, were the final pieces that would seal Julia's fate. The investigators were shocked. How could it be that the woman they had trusted to serve and protect them had been hiding such a dark secret all along? The answer, however, was clear. Detective Julia Thomas was not just a victim of circumstances. She had created this tragedy with her own hands. As the evidence mounted, the tension reached a boiling point. Julia's perfect world, the career she had spent years building, the relationships she had carefully cultivated, was crumbling before her eyes. The woman who had once been the embodiment of law and order was now a suspect in a cold-blooded murder. And there was no way out. The investigation was over. The truth had been uncovered, and the shocking revelation that one of their own was capable of such an act sent shockwaves through the entire police department, leaving everyone questioning the very foundation of trust that they had once relied on. The arrest of Detective Julia Thomas sent shockwaves throughout Oak Ridge, and not just because of the crime itself. It was the betrayal. The fact that someone sworn to uphold the law had so thoroughly violated it that left the town reeling. When Julia was led away in handcuffs, it was as if the world she had known, the life she had worked so hard to build, had crumbled to dust in an instant. For those who knew her, for her colleagues, her friends, and even her own family, this was a moment of unimaginable horror. How could someone who had been the embodiment of justice, who had protected her community with such dedication, be capable of committing such a heinous act? Julia's arrest was only the beginning of the fallout that would echo throughout the lives of those involved. The truth about her affair with Michael Wells, the hidden pregnancy, and the tragic murder soon became public knowledge, and the very foundation of Oak Ridge's police department was shaken to its core. It wasn't just a single life lost. It was an entire community's trust shattered in an instant. And as the case unfolded, the consequences only grew more devastating. For Julia's partner, Detective Lisa Wells, the emotional toll was devastating. He had defended her against any insinuations of guilt, convinced that she was innocent, even when the evidence began to mount against her. But as the investigation progressed and the overwhelming proof of Julia's involvement became undeniable, the revelation of Julia's crime sent ripples of disbelief throughout Oak Ridge. The residents, who had always seen her as a symbol of justice, now had to come to terms with the harsh reality that one of their own had been responsible for a murder that could have shattered an entire family. The idea that someone they trusted to protect them could commit such a brutal act left the community in a state of collective grief. People questioned their own safety, unsure who could be trusted when the very system meant to uphold justice had so thoroughly failed them. The local media covered every detail of the investigation, from the shocking discovery of Julia's affair to the chilling testimonies that painted a portrait of a woman driven to desperate extremes. The public's perception of law enforcement shifted dramatically. Where once Julia had been seen as a hero, now she was a symbol of corruption and betrayal, a cautionary tale of the dangers of secrets, of the destructive power of lies. Her name became synonymous with scandal, her actions a stain on the reputation of an entire department. The trial of Detective Julia Thomas was nothing short of a media frenzy. The courtrooms were packed every day, with people from all over the state tuning in to hear the details of the case unfold. There were countless legal battles, emotional testimonies, and devastating revelations. Julia's defense tried to argue that she had been pushed to the brink, that the affair had been a result of stress and loneliness, but the evidence was insurmountable. The affair, the pregnancy, the murder, it all came together in a tragic narrative that no one could deny. Julia's emotional breakdown on the witness stand painted a grim picture of a woman unraveling under the weight of her own choices. She spoke of the guilt, the shame, and the fear that had driven her to take the life of a man she had once loved. It was a haunting performance, but in the end it wasn't enough to save her. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and the sentence was swift. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Detective Julia Thomas left a scar on the law enforcement community that would never fully heal. Oak Ridge, once a small, peaceful town where trust in the justice system had been unshakable, now faced the long and painful process of rebuilding that trust. For officers who had worked with Julia, the impact was profound. Many of them struggled to reconcile the woman they had once respected with the criminal she had become. Could they ever trust their fellow officers again? Could they look at the badge they wore with pride, knowing that one of their own had so betrayed the very ideals they had pledged to uphold? The story of Julia's downfall became a cautionary tale for law enforcement agencies across the country. It was a stark reminder that even those who are tasked with upholding the law are not immune to the darkness that can lie within. The power dynamics in law enforcement, relationships, corruption, and the abuse of authority are not always as black and white as they appear. Julia's actions were a grim reflection of how far a person can fall when they abandon their own moral compass. What happens when those who are supposed to protect us become the ones we need protection from? The downfall of Detective Julia Thomas is a tragic reminder that power, when unchecked, can corrupt even the most dedicated individuals. The line between justice and lawlessness is thin, and when crossed it leads to consequences that can never be undone. The betrayal of trust, whether in a relationship, in a community, or in a profession, leaves deep scars that take years to heal. In the end, Julia's story is not just about a scandalous affair, a hidden pregnancy, and a murder. It's about the fragility of trust, the cost of secrets, and the devastating consequences of letting one's darker impulses take over. It's a story of how easily a life can be destroyed, how quickly a career can crumble, and how a community can lose its sense of security. The real question that lingers in the minds of everyone who followed this case is, how do we rebuild trust after it's been broken in such a fundamental way? Can we ever trust those who protect us again? The fallout from Julia's actions is a harsh reminder of how vulnerable we are when the very people who are sworn to protect us turn out to be the ones who betray us. The consequences of betrayal are far-reaching, and no one escapes unscathed. Do you believe this case was an unavoidable tragedy, or do you think there was a way for Julia to escape the web of lies she had spun? Would she have ever come clean if things had gone differently? What, if anything, could have prevented the ultimate destruction of everything she worked so hard to build? Or was this simply a situation where the truth was always bound to come out, no matter how dark and twisted it had become? We want to know your thoughts. Could the detective have walked away before things got worse, or was she already too deep in the lies? Could anyone have seen the signs before it was too late? And looking at the bigger picture, what do you think the story of Julia Thomas tells us about trust, betrayal, and the price of secrets? We invite you to leave your thoughts, theories, and reflections in the comments below. Join the conversation. Your opinions matter, and we'd love to hear from you. If this story has left you captivated, shaken, or questioning everything, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got more chilling true crime stories lined up, each one guaranteed to leave you on the edge of your seat. With in-depth investigations, shocking revelations, and the kind of suspense you won't find anywhere else, you won't want to miss what's coming next. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss an episode. The truth is often stranger and more horrifying than fiction, and we'll be here to bring you all of it. And if you found this case as unsettling as we did, share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who loves diving into the dark and twisted side of the truth. Every share helps us bring these stories to a wider audience, and we're grateful for every person who joins us in uncovering the darkest corners of the world. It's easy to think that this could never happen to us, but sometimes the most shocking truths are the ones that are closest to home. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.